Judas, is it with a kiss that you betray the Son of Man?
I love that new intro. Sorry. Hello, my name is Robbie. On here, I'm Templar Knight. Every person who believes in God but does not go to a church has a story why. But whenever two or more people gather in God's name, He is there. So this is church. Welcome. I'm glad that you're here. Tonight we are beginning our new series, Fate. The story of Judas Iscariot. And as I started doing research for this series, I was drawn elsewhere. Because the more I wanted to learn about Judas, the more I realized it's hard to figure out what is true and what is not, what is biblically accurate and what isn't. What is canon and what is not. And so it got me doing a little more research outside of my original topic. And I was curious about the creation of the Bible because it spanned over a very long time. I mean, the books of the Old Testament were written from and being preached from long before Jesus was even born. That's how Jesus was able to preach from books that his story would soon be added to. And it wasn't until almost 400 years after Jesus that all of the books were brought together to form the Bible. Now, to be selected to be a part of the Bible, a book had to have 5 qualities. First was that it had to be written by an apostle or someone closely associated with one. Secondly, did it have spiritual content that was already being read in churches? Third, was its doctrine proven? Was it preaching what the church wanted to be teaching so that there was no heresies? The fourth, was it already recognized by the churches? Now, most of these books had already been written long ago. It was just bringing them together to form the Bible that they needed to decide which books were they already using to teach from. And the fifth and final thing was, did this book hold the evidence of divine inspiration? Which, big church words, did God take part in the writing of this book? Was He influenced? Did God influence the people who wrote this book? So ultimately, at the Third Council of Carthage, in 397 AD, under the guidance of God, the church leaders agreed on the final selections of the New Testament. So it's almost 400 years after the birth and death of Jesus that all 77 books of the New Testament had been decided upon, and since then, not one has been added or removed. So with the Old Testament and the New Testament, we now have our Christian Bible. Now, I'm calling it the Christian Bible because the Jews only used the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which they call the Torah. Whereas Mormons, they added a complete third New Testament that they call the Book of Mormon. So for us Christians, we choose what is referred to as the Bible. And it's from that Council of Carthage that we finally had our Orthodox Bible. Now, the word Orthodox is just a fancy way of saying it's canon. It is confirmed to be true. Now, from this Bible, we have the Gospels. The first 4 books of the New Testament are considered the Gospel, the story about Jesus and his life. The Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All 4 of these books, brought together, were considered to be canon. And they all tell the same story, a lot of the same interactions, but from 4 slightly different perspectives. Sometimes they don't always agree. You could almost say that sometimes what was written in these Gospels was inspired by or copied from another one of the Gospels. The book of Mark will take something that was written in the book of Matthew, write that down, and then go into greater detail as to what happened and what was said. Some of the events were even rephrased and rewritten to match events that the prophet Zechariah had written in his book. Now, the book of Zechariah is an Old Testament book. This was around long before Jesus was, but it told the story. It prophesied. When Zacchaeus, he was a prophet, and he wrote down what would happen. Remember back when we talked about the wise men, and they would be drawn by a star? The story of Jesus was written before Jesus was around. Just sometimes it was in confusing phrases, because prophecies be like that sometimes. But oftentimes it was these prophecies that would be written of. These people say, hey, these prophecies are about us. This is what we're supposed to do. And so they would do it. And then they would write about that in these Gospels to show that, yes, this was prophesied way back here, and then it happened here, proving that Jesus is the prophesied King and the Son of God. So as I did more research into what put these books in the Bible, I found the part that ultimately led me on this search. Because many books that were written about this same time period, about these same events, they were not selected to be in the Bible. And they were deemed to be Gnostic, is the word. And according to Google, Gnostic means relating to knowledge, or especially mystical knowledge, something that you cannot know or cannot prove. So, yeah, it is basically these books claim to know something that isn't proven, or it's a secret knowledge. And so they weren't allowed into the Bible. Now, there are close to 52 Gnostic Gospels. There are over 100 Gnostic texts that were put forth to go into the Bible. 4 books were chosen to be the Orthodox canonized Gospels. The other 52 were not deemed worthy. They didn't meet the criteria that they needed for it to be in the Bible. Now, all of this I found out because the more I tried to learn about Judas Iscariot, the great betrayer, the more I wanted to find out about this man, the more I found out about the book of Judas. And I kept telling myself, if it's not in the Bible, it doesn't count. This is a Bible study. I can't use this information. There's no point in reading it. But my curiosity finally got the best of me. And so I looked into this book of Judas a little bit. And what I found out was in 1970, there was a burial tomb that was cracked open in Egypt. And in this tomb, they found a case. Inside this case, there was a bunch of scrolls and written word, but nobody fully knew what it was. So it was shopped around and ended up being stored in a safety deposit box for 16 years, which is obviously not good for it because this is ancient paper. Well, finally someone realized what they had. They recognized the language, and they found someone who could interpret it. Or what was left of it, because if you want, you can Google this. I mean, this was found in 1970. You can see the pictures of this text, the Chacos Codex, TCHACOS, Codex. And a lot of lines are missing. It should have been treated better than it was, but they didn't know what they had. So finally, once they got this codex in the right hands, they did their best to restore it, and they translated it. And what they realized they had was 4 books. One was the first apocalypse of James. Second was a letter from Peter to Philip. Third was a book of Alganese. And this codex also contained the Gospel of Judas. Now, the Gospel of Judas takes a stance that, a brief summary, that Judas and Jesus were actually very close, that Judas was his right-hand man, that Judas knew secrets that the other disciples couldn't know. It showed Jesus in a different light. I'll admit, I've read through it. It's not very long. Not like the 4 books, the Gospels that were put in the Bible. What was left of the Gospel of Judas that I have access to is not that long. But it had some very interesting and different takes from what I had always heard. But the Gospel of Judas was categorized as a Gnostic gospel. Because again, it's not canon. And it claims to have secret knowledge that only the writer knew about and no one else was allowed to know. It was a forbidden message. And the stories told in the Gospel of Judas took place over 8 days, starting 3 days before the celebration of the Passover. Now, it was with all of this that, I knew it was a Gnostic gospel, but I have a curiosity to understand things, even if it's not my intent to believe it. And it got me to take a closer look into the 4 canonized Gospels, the Gospels that appear in the Bible, to look at their similarities, their differences, their inspirations. But my hope is to use all of the resources before me to get an accurate idea of who Judas was, so that I can teach about him. Now, don't get me wrong, I am no scholar. I have not spent anywhere near the years of my life dedicated to learning about this man. But I'm reading from people who have. So in this series, there will be a lot of quotes. There will be a decent amount of paraphrasing. And a fair bit of my personal take on who Judas was. And I may be wrong. And it is perfectly okay for you to think that. What I hope is that this series will inspire conversation. That it will give you a desire to research information for yourself. And at no point in time do I want it to come across that I'm disagreeing with what the Bible said. The Bible is the undisputed Word of God. But as one of my mentors once taught me, You will never become a master chef if you only use one cookbook. Just make sure you know which one has the tried and true recipes. So before we go into this, there was one more point that I wanted to make clear. History is written by those who won. What would we know of the Second World War if Hitler had succeeded? Would the Battle of Stalingrad come across the same? What would the British say of the American Revolutionary War if the Americans had lost? Would the early settlers' way of guerrilla tactics, fighting from trees, and not the proper marching battle lines, would it be spoken of as such heroics and bravery? Or would it be shunned as a shameful way to engage in a dignified battle? Would we remember the story of Achilles and Odysseus had Troy never fallen? Or would we speak of the great Hector who defended his city from the brutish invaders? As history is written by the victors, it is also shaped by those who survived. And as we have seen time and time again throughout history, that books of false knowledge or books that are declared to be wrong, they are often destroyed and cast aside so that their knowledge will be lost. The book of Judas was declared Gnostic because it did not always agree with the teachings of the official Gospels. It and many other books that tried to find their way into the Bible were lost to history. History is written by those who won. So how do we learn about one of the greatest villains of Christianity, the Great Betrayer? Well, we will read from the Bible, which is the definitive Word of God. And with the right amount of caution and reserve, we will be open-minded about ideas given from sources not selected to be in the Bible. And ultimately, we will use our free will to decide for ourselves. So I ask that you proceed with an open mind as we learn about the man, Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed the Son of God.
Judas, is it with a kiss that you betray the Son of Man?